Hi everyone, welcome to the third session of the Month of Evolution. This year we are holding the annual Evolution Days online. Moreover, we are enlarging our event both by extending duration to a month and going international in collaboration with Evrim. We are so happy to share this period with you.
Month of Evolution started on 12th of February, which is Darwin Day, and it will end on 13th of March. We hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions during the presentation, just write them to chat. When the presentation is over, our team will ask our questions on your behalf. This year's event is far more meaningful due to the circumstances our university is in.
At this point, we feel the need to inform you. We are standing with our friends who got arrested during the protest against the non-democratic rector appointment that happened on the 2nd of January. We don't accept, we don't give up, and we won't bow down, as well as our professors who are also protesting this decision, exhibiting academic attitude.
In any case, we will continue to strive to bring science to you. As Biyoloji University Science Club, our goal is to facilitate access to science and accurate information, to spread scientific thinking, hereby to contribute to scientific enlightenment, which is our common dream as we can. And thanks to Dr. Esra Mungan, we learned about Dr. Kostas Kampourakis, a very valuable person who shares the same purpose with us, and we invited him. Now I want to give the floor to Esra Mungan.
Welcome everyone, and also this was a wonderful introduction in terms of also acknowledging what is happening at our university and the issues that universities in Turkey in general are facing. We are in a very legitimate struggle. This appointment, the opening of faculties, all of this is totally illegitimate, and we write about this and why this is the case. And our students are very legitimately and peacefully protesting against this. So it's completely unacceptable that we have arrested students under house arrest, and not just positive students. I mean, we mean all students who have in the process been arrested. So I join in the call of a release to all these students who are struggling for a better future in our country and at universities in our country. This generation, the young generation, deserves much better. I can say that for sure because I've been teaching for 18 years, and for 15 years I've been teaching evolution and behavior in an introductory psychology class where over 4 hours I try to convey to each year to 1,200 students from different departments what this idea of evolution is. About 15 years ago, 14 years ago, 13 years ago, I talked about more, how we can understand particularly animal behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So I gave many examples from ethology, etc. However, in the last 10 years, I more and more felt the need to really cover the first 2.5 hours on, even 3 hours on what evolutionary theory is about and what it is not about, what Darwin said and what he did not say. And over these 15 years of teaching this class to mostly first-year Biyoloji University students, after each class, I would have like many students coming and then asking me many questions and saying, Hocam, you said this, but then how to explain this? And through these questions, my course kept changing and changing, because as I was teaching in front of like 500, 600 students, which is not very interactive, thanks to these breaks in between, I then more and more delivered the material from the cognitive perspective of my students. So where do they get stuck? What do they misunderstand? And it's not always for religious reasons. Oftentimes it's really a cognitive misunderstanding, a fallacy of thinking, a little bit of folk thinking about evolution that creates this problem and that creates this, this is nonsense kind of idea. I don't even talk about the ridiculous media-like outlets that have these ridiculous fossil exhibitions and don't even have ever read any book by Darwin or anyone else. So through this, my class really started shaping, and I was actually thinking of writing a book in Turkish. I still think of doing it. Then in December 2014, I got a book called Understanding Evolution by Kostas Kampourakis, published by Cambridge University Press. Our university's publishing house, Biyoloji Üniversitesi'nde, yayın evi, sent it to me to see whether this is a good text to translate into Turkish and publish. I read it and I really loved it because it addressed this very thing of how certain concepts in evolution are misunderstood for cognitive reasons, for this cognitive blocks. So he very beautifully analyzed it, and I found quite a few parallel things that I also like to emphasize in my classes. So the text has now been translated. The translation is finished. However, since our university is the university that receives the least public funding by the state among all the 207 universities, the publishing house is not being able to publish it, but it will be published by Alfa Yayınları. So it's soon to come out as a müjde, good news. And my plans were that after it was published by our university press to invite Professor Kampourakis. So it's fantastic for me to have him here and listen to his talk. I also invited all my first year students to who I've also talked about evolution and behavior. So a warm welcome also from me to Professor Kampourakis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the kind words and, of course, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I would have been even happier to have traveled there, but let's hope that this will happen at some point soon. So the title of today's talk is about understanding evolution because, as you said, there are many issues regarding the acceptance of evolution. And I want to note that those of us who accept evolution should respect those who do not accept it. And instead of fighting with them, we should focus on help them better understand the science and what all this is all about. So I will just share my presentation. I hope that you can see it now.
Yes, we can see.
Thank you very much. So, understanding evolution, what this is all about. It is about understanding how the process of evolution take place, but also why people sometimes do not understand what is going on. The idea is that, as I will explain, the whole idea of evolution is sometimes counterintuitive. But let us get to that step by step. I would like to begin with some conclusions. Perhaps the most important conclusion of evolutionary theory is that all humans were a large extended family. We are a species that has evolved relatively recently in evolutionary time, and we're all related. Some of us are more closely related than others, but the biggest conclusion is that we're all an extended family. Another conclusion is that apes are our closest relatives, and this is a conclusion many people do not like as much as the previous one. However, this has been clear for a long time. You see here how Thomas Huxley presented the comparison of skeletons in 1863. And you see another presentation, another paper here from 1982, where they show that two chromosomes that we find in apes are homologous to our chromosome 2. And of course, since the genomes of all these species have been sequenced, it has become even more clearer that we are related. So I will not talk much about the evidence for evolution. I've seen that you have another talk about this, but I will just note that we have evidence from various fields: comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, comparative genomics, and of course the basics of cellular and molecular biology. All these point to a common descent for all organisms on Earth. And of course, there are details about how the divergence of species has taken place. So here is an overview of my presentation. I will begin in general talking about evolution and religion. There has been a lot in the press about evolution wars or about whether God is opposed to science. And there are long discussions about whether evolution and religion are at opposite extremes. There has been a lot of discussion from creationists. You see here the Institute of Creation Research in the United States, Answers in Genesis, the Creation Museum, and in all these websites, there's plenty of discussion and arguments against evolutionary theory. The Discovery Institute as well, and in some cases, as the Discovery Institute does here, they talk about the scientific controversy over evolution. And I want to note that there's no scientific controversy over the fact of evolution. There are debates and discussions about the details, which is perfectly normal to happen in science, about the exact processes of how things came to be as they are, but there's no debate, no controversy within science for the overall idea that organisms have a common ancestry and they have evolved through natural processes. Another important thing to note is that there is no one thing called creationism. I like this diagram by Eugenie Scott that shows that there's a variety, a continuum of views that we can describe as creationism. And you can see the most recent version, the intelligent design here. The whole idea is that there are many different views, and there is a continuum from a complete rejection of evolution to a complete acceptance of evolution. In the United States, there have been polls for almost the past 40 years showing that creationist views, the idea that God created humans in their present form, are the most accepted ones. But you can also see that evolutionism, the idea that humans evolved but God had no part in the process, has been steadily increasing from 9% before 1983 to 22% more recently. This shows that more and more people come to accept the idea of evolution. But as I will explain soon, interpreting these polls is not as simple as it may seem. Another poll here from the Pew Research Center shows that people think that generally science and religion are in conflict. 60%, almost 60% from the poll. However, less people believed that science conflicts with their own religious beliefs. So you see here a contrast. Whereas 1 out of 3 people approximately sees a conflict with her own views on religion and science, in general, there is an idea that these are in conflict. A very much cited paper from 2006 showing how the acceptance of the idea of evolution varies all over the world. The statement given to people was that whether human beings, as we know them, developed from earlier species of animals. And you see a variety of acceptance. Turkey is right here. Greece, my country of origin, does not do much better. Switzerland is where I work, is here. And you see that not many people in about half of the countries accept this idea. Another paper in Science focusing on Islamic Muslim countries shows that, well, we talked about Turkey, but the acceptance is even lower in other places. And a poll at the global level from Ipsos in 2011 that shows that the more religious a country is, the less people agree with evolution. This is the view, this is the picture that we usually use to refer to the idea of the conflict. But as I will soon explain, it's not as simple as that. And actually, sometimes these polls can be misleading. So the question is there really a dichotomy between religious views and Darwinism, or more generally the theory of evolution? We will see that having a dichotomy requires that all those people who accept evolution as a fact and who believe in evolutionary theory in the sense that they value and appreciate the theory are against religion. So it is interesting to see what happens in the case of scientists and how they approach religion. There was a poll in the United States about the religiosity of the general public and the scientists, and you see immediately here that whereas 83% of the participants said that they believe in God, this was the case for just 33% of scientists. But here you immediately see that among the scientists sampled, there's a variety of views. There are people who don't believe in God or a universal spirit. There are people who believe in a universal spirit but not God. And of course, there are scientists who believe in God. So we immediately see that there's a variety of views among scientists. A systematic study that was published in this book a few years ago, studying the religious views of 1,646 scientists in the United States, indicated that about half of them are somehow affiliated with the religion. And the same group continued with another study, a survey of more than 20,000 scientists in various countries in the world, again published in a book form, the book you see here. And their main conclusion was that there are more religious scientists than people usually think. It was the majority in Italy, Turkey, India, Taiwan, and about 1 in 3 in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Hong Kong. Atheist scientists, contrary to what we usually think, generally accept and respect they respect religion and they accept that people can be religious. And the idea that religion and science must conflict is primarily an invention of the West. We don't see this in other cultures. I like to think of this continuum as a continuum from atheism to religiosity, and I like to use these three scientists, Richard Dawkins, the late Stephen Jay Gould, and Simon Conway Morris, exactly because they're all proponents of evolution, but they disagree a lot on how to approach religion. And I do not mean to say that scientists should fall on one of these three views. I argue rather that there is a continuum from atheism to religiosity and back, and people might find themselves there, but I like to use these three examples because they have written books in which they express their beliefs. For Richard Dawkins, the illusion of design in the living world is explained by Darwinian natural selection, so that there's no need for God to explain what we see. And for him, atheism nearly always indicates a healthy independence of mind. At the other extreme, we find Simon Conway Morris, who thinks that we might have to try to reunify the scientific worldview with the religious instinct, because both of these can contribute to our understanding. And he concludes the book by saying that for some people, it will all remain as the pointless activity of the blind watchmaker. This is a clear reference to Dawkins, but others may prefer to remove their dark glasses. With this, he means that some people might want to look beyond the scientific facts and think whether there are other kinds of knowledge we might use. And the choice, of course, he says to readers in yours. And somewhere in between, we find Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote that he did not understand why then two enterprises should experience any kind of conflict. He said that he was an agnostic, meaning that he really didn't know whether God exists or not. Nonetheless, he had, as he stated, a great respect for religion. So if you take these arguments and you compare them, you see that they are entirely different. Regarding the existence of God, for Dawkins, it's improbable, for Gould, unknowable, and for Conway Morris, probable. Regarding the question of the existence of God, for Dawkins, it was scientific. For Gould, something science could not answer. And for Conway Morris, it was theological. Regarding the status of religion for humans, unimportant and unnecessary for Dawkins, important for Gould and necessary for Conway Morris. And regarding the relation between religion and science, it was conflict for Dawkins, coexistence for Gould, and unification for Conway Morris. With this, I want to show that if we go deep into how scientists think, we will see that there are different kinds of views. And I think this is perfectly normal, because it is one thing to accept and understand the facts of science and the conclusions of scientific research, and another to what inferences one can make based on this about one's worldviews and beliefs. Which brings us now to the discussion and the distinction between belief and knowledge. A main question in epistemology is how are belief and knowledge related? And we can say simply put that belief is a necessary condition of knowledge. We cannot know that something is the case without believing that this something is the case. And here there's a key conceptual distinction that I want to highlight before turning to the interpretation of Paul's, between believing in something and believing about something, having beliefs in something and beliefs about something. Let me explain. A child might have many beliefs about Santa Claus without believing in him. This means that a child might believe that Santa Claus has a beard, as you see here, wears red clothes, he's a nice person, etc., without believing in his actual existence. Having beliefs about something means that we have thoughts about how something is without necessarily believing that this is real. Regarding a theory, we can also have belief in a theory in the sense that we esteem and value a theory. Believing in a theory doesn't mean that we accept it as a religious dogma. It means that we esteem and value the theory and we are able to use it to make predictions and explanations. Of course, evolution is not a theory in the sense that this caricature here implies a hypothesis, but it is a solid theory that can be used to make valuable predictions and explanations. So, where this brings us is that a person can have accurate beliefs about a theory without believing in it. And this would be a case of a biologist who is working on evolutionary theory, who uses evolutionary theory to make predictions, explanations, without believing in the theory because of her religious views. At the same time, we can have belief in a theory without accurate beliefs about it. A student might believe in evolutionary theory because she has heard Richard Dawkins say it is true, even if she doesn't know anything about the theory, how to use it, or even why it is true. And the point here is that there are many people who accept evolution without really understanding it. And my point here is that we need to insist on understanding the theory before discussing anything about acceptance, because this is what is valuable in science, understanding. Let us now use this background to look back at the polls and the public acceptance of evolution. There has been a lot of discussion about the kinds of questions that polls ask. And this nice article here, published 10 years ago, points to questions that might make people, participants in these polls, feel uncomfortable and not choosing the answers they might otherwise choose. Here's a concrete example by another fine paper by Fern Elston Baker. She analyzed a 2008 poll on evolution from BBC, and people there had to choose among these three statements. That the evolution theory says that humankind has developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, and God had no part in this process. The creationist theory says that God created humankind pretty much in his or present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. And the intelligent design theory says that certain features of living things are best explained by the intervention of a supernatural being such as God. What Fern notes here is that people had to choose between evolution and either creationism or intelligent design. There was no place for what we might call theistic evolution or evolution with that was set up by God, which in this sense forced religious people to choose among these two creationist views. And this is why she titled the article Creating Creationists. The point here is that we may misrepresent how people actually think because of the questions we ask them. And I turn back to the article from Science I presented earlier, just to note that this was a compilation of different studies. And you see here one large part of the data that came from the Eurobarometer study. And what we see here is that whereas there are many people who say, I believe there's a God, there were almost everywhere less people saying that this statement, that human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals, is false. Which means, simply put, that not all people who said that believe in God rejected the idea of evolution. Another example from the Ipsos study I also mentioned a while ago. I said that the more religious a country is, the less accepted evolution is as an idea. But if you look closely at the statement, we compare two different things. We compare whether people believe in God and whether they agree with evolutionists, which can be summarized as a comparison between a belief in God and the belief about evolution, which, as I showed, are two different kinds of questions. So the first thing to note is that we may compare questions that are not comparable. We might ask people whether they believe in God or whether they accept the theory of evolution. They believe in the theory of evolution in the sense that I described, or what beliefs they have about God and what beliefs they have about evolution. And it has been shown that when we ask people not what they believe in, but what their beliefs are about God and religiosity, the responses can be different. However, the most interesting thing that I found, and again, we have the same comparison here, when I looked closely at the poll, is that whereas there are different countries in terms of different results in the countries in terms of religiosity, almost in all countries, about 1 in 3 people answered that they do not know what to believe about the origin of humans. And this is a very important finding that we need to pay attention to. Instead of looking only at the contrast between acceptance of evolution and belief in God, we should look at the people who are a lot who do not really know what to believe and address their concerns. And another finding from the same poll was again that not all religious people that you see here in blue agree with creationists, which you see here in red, which means again that not all religious people are creationists. So my point here is that whereas we usually look at this picture here and the contrast between belief in God and acceptance of evolution, all I want to note is that the picture is more complex and there are many other interesting findings that we need to pay attention to, such as that 1 in 3 people do not know what to believe, or that not all religious people are creationists. Another point is what exactly we ask, and this is what I mentioned here. If you look at the results of the Gallup and the Pew polls on evolution in approximate, at the same time approximately, you see that there are differences. More people in the Pew poll accept evolution than in the Gallup poll. And I have to note that these are polls who took place in the United States, which means that they're supposed to have representative samples from the same country. And if you look at how many people accepted that humans evolved with God guiding, or a supreme being guided evolution, you see that then these are the people that accept that are more in the Gallup poll. And this is the case, again, for creationism, the idea that God created humans in present form. So what we see here overall is that more people in the Pew poll accept evolution, and more people in the Gallup poll accept the idea of God guiding evolution, or the idea that God created humans. And I wondered what might be the reason. And if you look closely, you will see that the items in the Gallup poll, they all have the word God in the statements. So this might be some kind of influence, but of course, this is not something that I can infer like this. We should have a proper test to test it. And actually, a more recent poll, again, from the same organizations, the Gallup 2019 and the Pew 2018, show differences in the results, even though in this case, you see that the word God was almost everywhere. Still, more people in the Pew accepted the idea of evolution. And you see now here that those accepting theistic evolution are again a lot in the pew. I do not want to try to interpret the findings of these polls, and actually the people running these polls have made other comparisons about how to ask the questions, whether to give all options at the same time or differently. But all I want to show is that interpreting these polls is far from straightforward and simple. We have to look at the questions, and we have to see the content, the conceptual content in these items. Now, having presenting all this, all I'm saying is that perhaps we need to go and look what is going on beyond worldviews and religion, because it's not all about this. The big question and the big debate is about the evidence. And of course, scientists might say that, well, we have so much evidence in favor of evolution, but people just reject it because of their faith. And of course, this is an issue, but it may be a bit more complicated than that. There is a nice debate at the Creation Museum between Ken Ham and the science guy. And it is interesting how they presented the debate with these slides. The contrast presented was how people make inferences on the basis of evidence. And Ken Ham said that his inferences from the same evidence lead to creation, whereas the evolution proponent said that his inferences point to evolution. And what Ken Ham noted in his presentation is that the debate is a battle over the same evidence, and it is just a matter of interpretation. And you see here again the same idea. What do we infer from that? Naturalism and Darwin, or creation and what is in the Bible, for instance, or God's word, or in the other religious texts? Other arguments advanced more recently and perhaps more sophisticated was arguments like the one by Michael Behe, who talks about irreducible complexity. And he writes in the book that it is extraordinarily difficult to rigorously envision how systems such as the cilium, flagellum, or blood clotting cascade could have arisen from simpler systems by the numerous successive and slight modifications imagined by Darwin. And he thus defined irreducible complexity as the property of a system that need to have all the parts for proper functioning, which entails that if we remove the part, the system would not function. So it is impossible for a complex system to have evolved in small steps because removing one of these parts would make it non-functional. But a nice response came by MacDonald, who showed that there was a flaw in that argument because, and he used this mousetrap as an example, if there's a function here, it doesn't mean that removing parts would make them functionless. Rather, we may have simple structures that have different functions and that eventually evolved to have a more complex function in a more complex way. And actually, Ken Miller has nicely illustrated this in one of his talks. So the point here is that if we have a complex function by a complex system, we do not need that system to have advanced all at once or to have been selected for that particular function. We can have simple systems, simple parts of the system evolving for different functions and eventually arriving at what we have here. Another interesting case, this textbook by Ken Miller at some point was given out with the stickers saying that this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And when Ken Miller was asked about this by a journalist, as he said in a talk, and while the journalist expected him to react and say that, no, this is wrong, he actually said that it didn't go far enough. And he said that there should be stickers saying that this textbook contains material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence, everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. So what Ken Miller said here is that what the sticker is questioning is not something related to evolution only. It is something about how science operates and how the scientific communities arrive at conclusions. And actually, when there was a trial for this, the decision was that the sticker can be interpreted to convey a message of endurance of religion, and it must be declared unconstitutional. And that was when they were removed. I like this caricature here because it nicely summarizes the problem. And the problem is not related to religion. It's related to how we understand the nature of science. And there's a fine book by Massimo Pigliucci here that nicely describes these issues. So, whereas in science, scientists begin with the facts and ask what conclusions they can draw, the creationists and those in general who reject evolution begin with a conclusion and ask what facts they can find to support it. So if I try to analyze the arguments in these two cases, it should be something like this. The creationists begin with a conclusion, for instance, that God created the world and humans, and they look for data that under their own creationist or intelligent design theory, it becomes evidence to support the conclusion. Whereas what scientists actually do is that they have data that becomes evidence under the light of evolutionary theory, but this can lead to different conclusions, even at the same time or during time, throughout time, and for which we have to find additional data and refine our theories. I must note that refining the theory doesn't mean changing the core of the theory, because the core of the theory, as Darwin presented it, descent with modification, is actually the same even today. But what has changed a lot are the details of what we know, and this is what is happening here. So I would suggest that the problem, the big issue with anti-evolutionists and creationists beyond worldviews and religion is how they understand, if they understand at all, how science works. And whenever we have missing data, or what they describe as missing links, we don't need God to fill these gaps. We need to be patient and be aware that we may never have all these answers. And whenever we see scientists debating different hypotheses, this doesn't mean that science is in crisis. Rather, this is perfectly normal to happen in science, because this is what makes science advance. So here is an actual representation of human evolution by Bernard Wood. We do not know exactly how the fossils of the various species that we have found relate to one another, because we do not know. We have a fragmented view of human evolution, but we have also a solid view that evolution has taken place. So all I'm saying, and this is an excellent website to look at these issues, is that to help people understand evolution, perhaps we first need to help them understand how science works and what are the processes for doing sciences, making inferences, arriving at conclusions, and then refining these conclusions. So instead of bringing ourselves into weird situations, such as discussing religious views in science classes or science in the church, we might try to think that religious knowledge and scientific knowledge are different kinds of knowledges, as Bob Audi shows in his book, in his article in the book on epistemology. There are different kinds of knowledge, but when it comes to scientific knowledge, it is as solid as it can be based on how we can perceive our surroundings, and we do not need anything else beyond that to understand in rational terms how the world works. Now, if people need more than that, they can, of course, go and look at other kinds of knowledge. But whatever they find there does not question the scientific knowledge that we have, unless the scientists themselves find different kinds of evidence. I also want to note that in recent years, we have had a tendency of people to accept scientism, which is an exaggerated reliance on science to make inferences. And I want to argue against this because the point is not to do what the figure here shows. We don't want people to accept evolution unquestionably. We want people to understand evolution, to understand how the science is done and what the conclusions are. And of course, we can question the fact if the time comes and if we have sufficient evidence, but not before that time comes, not until then. So the whole point about doing science is questioning and questioning and questioning again in order to ensure that we have the most solid knowledge possible. The big problem now, I think we have to deal with, after we deal with how science works, is what psychologists have described as the design stance. And let me illustrate this with a simple example. Ask anybody why birds have wings, and they will tell you in order to fly, having perhaps this eagle in mind. But if you show them another organism, they might say in order to swim or nothing at all. The issue here is that functional explanations for organisms can be difficult exactly because not all their parts exist for the same role. If we ask the question why airplanes have wings, the answer is simple, in order to fly. But why is this the case? Because airplanes are artifacts intentionally designed for a purpose, to fly. So there's a lot of research, and here I show just a few papers, that people intuitively tend to think for the parts of organisms, such as the wings here, in the same way they think of the parts of artifacts, that they have been designed for a purpose. But this is not the case, exactly because, as we saw here, not all organisms, not all birds use their wings for flying. And the reason for this, the explanation for this, is evolution and divergence. More generally, there is research in psychology that shows that people tend to believe that there is fate, that the future is prescribed, and that they see purpose in design not only in nature but in the world. So that's a broader tendency, the design stance, to perceive design in the world. And this serves as an obstacle to understanding evolution. There's, of course, research in science education that also shows that students intuitively think that individuals can evolve to acquire the parts that they have. And here our goal is to help them understand that what evolves are the populations, not the individuals. And a big issue related to that is perhaps the metaphors that scientists themselves use. The machine metaphor might eventually cause a big problem, and these are two fine articles making the point for this, exactly because if we think of organisms as machines, we know that machines are designed and have all the functional parts they need. But this is not the case for organisms, because they're not designed, and this becomes clear by the fact that they do not have all the parts they need. Sometimes they have malfunctioning parts or parts that do nothing at all. So using this kind of metaphor might eventually cause problems exactly because it makes us see organisms as if they were designed in the way the machines are designed. And of course, books, otherwise fine books, also may anthropomorphize natural selection as the watchmaker on the tinkerer, which is also implicitly problematic. These two books are fine and what they say is excellent, but perhaps anthropomorphizing natural selection is something we had better avoid. Because the way natural selection works is not like this. It's not organisms that decide what to do. It's a population phenomenon that works given the antecedent conditions that are available there. So there are two crucial differences between organisms and artifacts. Organisms are not intentionally designed. Artifacts are. Organisms do not have fixed essences that do not change. Artifacts do. These are the intuitions called design teleology and psychological essentialism. Now, the problem is that people more often than not think exactly the opposite. They think that it is organisms that are intentionally designed and that have fixed essences, perhaps because our early awareness of artifacts makes us extrapolate artifact thinking to organisms. And this is something that school science has to address. So what can we do? How can we address the design stance? I think the first thing to do, and this is a distinction I've seen in kindergartens, the distinction between living and non-living objects, and then the distinction between among the non-living between natural objects and artifacts should be reversed. We shouldn't teach kids the living, non-living distinction first. We should teach them the design, not design distinction between artifacts and natural objects. And then among the natural objects which are not designed, we can talk about living and non-living. That might be a first step to follow. We should also insist in all biology classes that organisms are not perfectly adapted. Unfortunately, there are textbooks and documentaries that show these kinds of images and makes us think that this frog here has adapted in the way this soldier here has concealed himself. However, what we see in nature is an enormous variation of characteristics. And it is the case that not all organisms are perfectly adapted. An example I used when I was teaching biology at school was something that came from a documentary I once watched. There's this whale here with her baby swimming around, and suddenly these bad guys come up and try to separate the mother from the baby. When I asked students why all these animals have hydrodynamic shapes, they said that they have these hydrodynamic shapes in order to swim. Then these two orcas managed to separate the baby from the mother, and they pushed the baby down in the sea until it drowned. And then the question asked to students was, why do these organisms have lungs and not gills? Why don't they have these organs that fish have to breathe underwater? And they were ecstatic like this. And it is then that they realized that organisms do not have everything they need. And actually, this is an argument that we need to make in every class. Organisms are not perfectly adapted. And we can use examples like this to illustrate this. Another important point, the metaphor of the tape used by Stephen Jay Gould and the various possible outcomes during evolution. We can show students with actual examples that an initial population might evolve through natural selection, through drift and other stochastic processes, or it may not change at all. And this is something that we do not know in advance. This is the first dimension of contingency, unpredictability. There are several paths, and we do not know which one will be taken. But once a path is taken, we can arrive at different outcomes. And this is the second dimension. It's called causal dependence. And actually, what we see in organisms today is the outcome of causal dependence. Depending on the path taken in the past, we arrive at the situation we are today. We can also tell them about evolution of development, the exciting new field of evolutionary developmental biology, with actual examples that show that large changes in organisms may not be due to changes in the genes themselves, but rather in the expression of these genes. And actually, Evo-Devo shows that we can have large morphological changes in evolution with minor changes at the level of DNA. And this is what makes evolution possible. So, with this, I want to get back to the initial issue between religion and science. And I want to quote two atheist philosophers who have written two books which are great to address these issues. Here, Michael Ruse, and you can replace Christian with any religion you want, but he wrote about Christianism because this is the context in which the theory developed. He says that, can a Darwinian be a Christian or whatever else you want? Absolutely. Is it always easy? No. Is a Darwinian obligated to be a Christian? Not again, but try to understand those who are. Is a Christian obligated to be a Darwinian? No, but you have to realize whether your God-given potential and talents are being used to the full. He very nicely shows that there is no rational reason to make a separation, to make a choice, either a Darwinian or a religious person. Philip Kitcher, in another excellent book, makes a similar point, that there's truth in Marx's dictum that religion is the opium of the people, but he says the consumption should be seen as medical rather than recreational. What he says here is that people may have a need for religion, and we need to respect that. We shouldn't disrespect people for their religious beliefs. But when we respect them, we can also tell them about the findings of science and show them that they can both be religious and accept the Darwinian theory of evolution. And with this, I want to conclude by saying that my main message today would be that those of us who accept evolution should respect people who disagree with us, and we should try to help them understand the science, how science works, and what we have found about the evolution of life on Earth. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Before that, if you're interested in these arguments, this is the book in which I write about contingency. And Understanding Evolution has a new edition. You all earlier saw the original one, but there's a new edition that came out last October, again by Cambridge University Press, with an updated, revised, and concise version. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you once again for making this event happen in these dark days, Dr. Kampourakis. It was a very pleasant presentation that raised excellent questions. Our team has edited the questions asked so far. You can still ask questions, by the way. We will forward them if the time remains. So if Dr. Kampourakis and the question team are ready, we can begin our question and answer session.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, then. First of all, your presentation was very interesting. Thank you. It helped us a lot, I think, because, as you know, we are trying to tell people about evolution and science, and it's helpful for us. I have a personal question. It's not from our viewers. As you know, our committee's goal is telling science and evolution to people, especially in Turkey. And one of our biggest concerns is the relation between science and religion. And people think that evolution means atheism. How can we explain ourselves briefly if you want to tell it's not? How should our approach be?
Yeah. First of all, if you look at the history of science, there's an excellent book by John Hedley Brooke published 30 years ago on the topic. There has never been a clear conflict between science and religion. The relationship has always been complicated. Initially, during what we call the scientific revolution, religion actually supported the science of the time. But again, this is not as simple as I describe it now. There was always a complex relation. I think that what people can do is that we have to refrain from thinking what we believe. If you ask me personally, I will tell you that religion and science are incompatible. That's what I see. But I also know that, as I presented, about half of the scientists who know the science better than I do are religious. So my view is that I have to forget what I believe in normative terms, and I have to look at the evidence if I want to describe myself as a scientist, and explain and understand the evidence that half of the scientists are religious, and try to understand what the scientists actually believe in. And I showed two books that go into large detail. So my recommendation for you in particular, and for every person who's dealing with strong resistance, is to show people that there are actual scientists, evolutionary scientists who are religious, and try to describe to them their actual beliefs and how these people find compatibility between the science they study and their religious views. If you ask myself, I would, as I write in my book, I would position myself somewhere between Gould and Dawkins, not exactly where. I would say I'm closer to Gould than to Dawkins. But why anybody should care about this, and why anybody should think about a theoretical argument I could actually make? What I say in my book is that whatever I believe, and notwithstanding what I believe, the important issue is that there are people who study science and are religious. And so this, in my view, is solid empirical evidence that incompatibility is not what exists. Did I answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah,
I'm not sure if you have. I know many examples of evolutionary biologists who are religious, both from the history of science. Theodosius Dobzhansky is a classic example. The person who wrote the article in 1973 in the American Biology Teacher that nothing in evolution makes sense, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And we might want to look at what scientists write. I show the books by Dawkins, Gould, and Conway Morris. And as I said, it would be crucial for you to see if there are, in your country or in other countries, evolutionary biologists who are also religious, and bring them to explain to those who resist evolution what exactly they think. Because there's a nice quote I didn't use in this presentation. We have a discussion about this next Tuesday on a Facebook event by Cambridge University Press, and I kept the quote for there. There's a nice quote by historian Adam Latz, who says that people like Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins have written books about evolution, excellent books. We've learned a lot. But he says asking people like Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne about creationism is like asking a cardiologist about heartbreak. The issue here is that the problem with religious resistance to evolution is emotional, emotional obstacle. It's not conceptual. So I think that there are two aims. One aim is to address the conceptual obstacles, and I hope I have shown various ways to do this. But perhaps before doing that, you have to address the emotional obstacles. And in my view, the simplest way to do this is respect. Respect people who think about this, because it's their right to feel threatened by something that really challenges their religion. And then you might do two things. First, bring people who find this compatibility and explain to them how they think. Religious scientists would be a great case. And then help them understand the conceptual part that I prefer to focus on. Because as I say in my book, once you understand the science, people should feel free to believe whatever they want.
Okay, it was a very nice answer. Thank you.
And dear Kampourakis, thanks for your excellent presentation. One of our participants asked a good question. Which philosophers or scientists before Darwin pointed out the possibility of evolution or similar ideas? I know his grandfather and Alfred Wallace were working on it.
You mean before Darwin or at the same time?
Before
anyway,
Darwin.
I can answer both. So the idea of evolution was, of course, there already before Darwin. His own grandfather Erasmus had written about this. There were French naturalists like Lamarck and Jean Lamarck and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire who have, and even Cuvier, Georges Cuvier, who had provided evidence for evolution. So the idea was there. And what was new with Darwin was the process of evolution and his analogy from artificial selection in breeding to natural selection. Now, the question with Wallace and the priority with Wallace has been discussed by historians, and my understanding is that Darwin definitely had the priority because he came up with the idea before Wallace. And in essence, Wallace's theory was a bit different than Darwin's. To this, I should add that Wallace also came to exclude humans from the process of evolution. He was a kind of spiritualist. So if we bring all this together, I think that Darwin rightly is considered the father of evolution, even though I completely dislike finding fathers and mothers in science, exactly because everybody always builds on the words of people who worked before him. Now, what Darwin did is that he read a lot. He read a lot about nature. He became a naturalist, an accomplished naturalist himself. And then he managed to bring together the knowledge of the time and combine the views of Malthus with the ideas of the breeders and perhaps the ideas of the division of labor in nature. There's a detailed discussion about this, of how he came to develop the theory. And the most important thing, and that's crucial, and that's a whole chapter in my book, is that it took him about 20 years to overcome his own conceptual obstacles and find the evidence that eventually convinced him to publish the theory. And actually, Darwin's shift was not one from theology and theism to atheism, but it was a trip from a design view of the world to one where natural selection and death are the main factors.
Thank you. One of our participants asked that how powerful will religion be 200 years from now? Will there still be a conflict between religion and science?
In 200 years from now?
Yes.
Well, I have no idea. But, you know, if I had to make a prediction, I would say that there will always be some kind of resistance, because there will always be people who will feel threatened. And this is normal. What we have to do from the perspective of science and science education is to try to comfort these people and help them understand the science. I think this is our mission. We don't want them to believe in evolution in the same way they believe in their religion. We want them to believe in evolution in the sense that they understand and appreciate and value the theory and its enormous explanatory potential. Some people will be willing to do that, some others will not. But I mean, as in science education, it's never the case that we can have all our students learn what we want them to learn, but we can try to help as many as we can to understand what is going on. The current pandemic is an exemplar case. You know, many people a year ago were talking about whether the virus was a weapon, a biological weapon, whether it was designed. And then a couple of papers came out immediately showing the sequences of the new virus and the older ones. And it was as simple as that, to show that the new one was related to ones that existed. But to understand this, you have to understand how to read the phylogenetic trees and understand how evolution at the molecular level takes place. And this is why we actually need to have this kind of understanding.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the nicest presentation. And one of our participants asked a very intriguing question. Do you think we should make an effort to make people believe in evolution and science, or should science go on its own way?
I think that the whole aim of science education at schools is to help people understand science and believe in science, again, in the sense that I mentioned, understand, appreciate, and value the scientific theories for which we have evidence. I don't think that we should try to indoctrinate people in any way, accept the science just because teachers tell them, because I think it's pointless. We have to help people understand, but to help people understand science, again, we have to do two things. First, respect their non-scientific views, their worldviews, their beliefs, and there are many kinds of different beliefs. I mean, vaccination is another issue where we have emotional obstacles. We have to respect what people think, and then help them understand what science tells us about this. In one of our books, we wrote that if you look at climate change denialists, if you look at those who reject human evolution like creationists, if you look at people who are against the vaccines, if you look at the details of their arguments, there is a common underlying element. It's about uncertainty. And uncertainty, as we write in that book, is normal in science. It actually makes science advance because asking questions. Now, what we have to do is to stop presenting science in schools and everywhere as the world that gives the correct answers. Science can provide the best answers possible, but as the history of science has shown, some of them ended up being considered as wrong. This does not mean that we can reject all the past theories outrightly, because the past theories and the mistakes of the past theories eventually provided the basis for what we might call the advancement of science to what we have today.
Thank you very much for the answer.
There's one more question left, which is, what kind of pseudoscience does evolution theory face often, both by supporters, deniers, and by percentage? How much of evolution theory you think is based on interpretation?
Can you please repeat the question, because I'm not sure I understood it.
Okay. What kind of pseudoscience does evolution theory face often, both by supporters, deniers, and by percentage? How much of evolution theory you think is based on interpretation?
I would say that everything in science is based on interpretation, because there are many examples where different scientists make different interpretations of the same data. And so the same data can become evidence for different arguments and different conclusions. One important issue is that our cognitive capacities are limited, and so we can infer about the world what we can perceive, see, hear.
There's a problem in network.
Understand the world. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you now.
Yeah.
No,
So I was saying that having said that humans have limited abilities to perceive the world, when we see the scientific community agreeing on specific conclusions, these are the best conclusions that we can have. It's, I think. The point is that at every single point in history, when the majority of scientists arrives at some conclusion, this is the best and the most solid rational knowledge that we can have about the world, even if it is a matter of interpretation. And as I said, exactly because it is a matter of interpretation and exactly because new data will come up in the future, science is always open in reinterpreting this and arriving at even better conclusion. There's a great book by Mark Musling on climate change, and he says that he discusses the reports of the International Panel on Climate Change, and he says that the uncertainties in the most recent report are a lot more than the uncertainties in the previous one, only because we now understand the phenomena better. And because we understand the phenomena better, we become more aware of the uncertainties. Now, how to explain this? That's a difficult task. How to explain that science is a matter of interpretation, that it can be subjective sometimes, but it is the most solid knowledge that we have, how we can say that it's normal for scientific theories to be revised, but this has to do with the periphery, perhaps not the core of the theory. As I said, descent modification is still the essence of evolution, if there is an essence in evolutionary theory. That's a difficult task. And this has to do with what we call nature of science in science education. teaching about how science works. That's a human activity with limitations, but also a huge potential.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may add, because you mentioned the word pseudoscience, the demarcation is something that philosophers have long shown it's not as simple to do, but I don't think that's a major issue. I mean, we do not need to have to make this distinction. What we have to do is that for those conclusions that are strongly supported by evidence, we just need to have to show the evidence and explain to people the explanatory potential of science. But here's the key issue. It's not only about rote knowledge, it's also about explanations. So we have to explain to people, to tell people, to make them understand how to explain and how to use the theories.
Thank you for your enlightening answers. We have come to the end. We thank our guests, Kostas, Kampourakis, and all the participants. Thank you all for making this event happen in these dark days. We will continue the month of evolution with Semih Taren. He will give a talk about COVID-19. Afterwards, we will continue the month of evolution with Kenneth Miller and then Çağnak Şekercioğlu. I will now make an announcement in Turkish about subtitles. Arkadaşlar biz Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Bilim Kulübü Evrim Ağacı Kurulu olarak konuşma bittikten sonra altyazıları düzenleyerek kanala koyuyoruz. Onun için bu konuda bir sıkıntı yok. Koyacağız. Teşekkür ederiz katılımınız için. Hoşça kalın.